Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman. I'm the coordinator of CIGI's Global Policy Forum in Ottawa. This is the second of 6 forums we'll be holding in this 2014-2015 period in Ottawa. I'm delighted to welcome guests from the Diplomatic Corps, and I see that the Ambassador of Japan, His Excellency Norihiro Okuda, is with us, as well as representatives from the embassies of Egypt, Russia, Indonesia, Germany, and Mexico. And there are also representatives of the Government of Canada, Parliament, various departments, including Citizen, Immigration, Heritage Canada, IDRC, and the University of Ottawa and Carleton Universities, and the Canadian Council of Chief Executives and the Global Center for Pluralism. I don't see John, but he's supposed to be here, and the Canadian International Council. David Dement, the president, is here. It's now my pleasure to ask Fen Hamson, who is the Distinguished Fellow at CIGI and the Director of the Global Security and Politics Program of CIGI, to introduce our guest speaker. Fen?
Thank you, Larry. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, Dr. Shadi Hamid. He is a fellow with the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, and the author of the acclaimed book, Temptations of Power, Islamicists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, published by Oxford University Press this year. He served as Director of Research at the Brookings Institution Center in Doha until January of this year. Prior to joining Brookings, he was Director of Research on the Project on Middle East Democracy and a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University. And he is currently Vice Chair of the Project on Middle East Democracy, a member of the World Bank Middle East and North Africa Advisory Panel, and as many of you know, a contributing writer for that well-known magazine, The Atlantic. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, New Republic, Slate, Forbes, The National Interest, Policy Review, and the Journal of Democracy. He's a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, well known to many of you, and he received his PhD in political science a number of years ago from Oxford University. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome on a very cold November day to Dr. Hamid.
Thank you, Fen, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the Center for International Governance and Innovation for having me. It's my first time in Ottawa, so it's a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. Thanks for coming out. Before I kind of get into the meat of our discussion, and I'll be covering quite a bit of ground. Let me just say a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of how I study some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight. So I started conducting field research on Islamist movements in 2004-2005. I was a Fulbright Fellow in Jordan. I was a naive graduate student at the time, and I would just kind of hang out at the Muslim Brotherhood headquarters. I'd spend a lot of time in their archive room. And some of the guys in the Brotherhood were a little bit confused. What does this American researcher want? Why is he so interested in us? And that was a time when Jordan got even less attention than it does today. And the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood still doesn't get much attention. So they were somewhat bemused. But that was kind of the start of a long 10-year process, which led to my my recently published book, where I really tried to immerse myself in the world of political Islam. And this seems somewhat self-evident to me, but it isn't always. So I think it bears repeating that we don't have to like Islamists, but I do think we have to understand them. And the only way to understand them is by doing something rather simple, spending time with them, sitting down with them, talking to them as real people, as real individuals with their own hopes, fears, and aspirations. That's what I've tried to do over this period of time. And I have to say it's been fascinating, and even for better and worse, and I'll get into that. Now, let me just kind of start by saying that I think when we try to make sense of the Arab Spring, it's been almost 4 years now, and I was in Tahrir Square when Mubarak fell on February 11th, 2011, and it was a remarkable experience. But when I think about it now, it makes me a little bit sad to remember how Egyptians felt that day and how so many people in the region felt. And I remember later that night, I was writing up an article, and I overheard someone in a cafe saying, an Egyptian woman saying, I've never seen Egyptians so happy in my life, and I think she was right. People were dancing in the street. It was one of those moments, once in a lifetime moments. And almost 4 years later, it's really striking to see how much the fortunes of the region have shifted. So I think part of the issue is that I think we were spoiled by previous transitions. I mean, whether in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and we thought that maybe it would proceed in a similar way, that there would be this kind of positive trajectory towards liberal democracy or something like it. And so one thing I want to talk a little bit about is, why is the Middle East different? Why is it even exceptional, if I can use that word? And I feel like that's a subtext of so many questions that I get today, whether it's from journalists, other researchers, or people who are interested in the Middle East and trying to make sense of what's happening. What exactly is going on here? Because something clearly very dark, disturbing, and distinctive even is happening. So that's what in the next the next 30 minutes or so, I wanna delve a little bit deeply and see if we can make sense of the exceptional nature of the Middle East. Now, one, I think, major point of difference. So if we want to talk about Islamists, and let me just very quickly, when I say mainstream Islamists, I'm talking about the affiliates and descendants of the Muslim Brotherhood, the mainstream of political Islam, and I'll talk about what the mainstream of political Islam is characterized by, but essentially groups that have been willing to work within the political process in a gradualist fashion, in distinction to, say, groups like ISIS, which are, to put it mildly, not gradualists. Now, if we look at socialists and Christian Democrats in Latin America or Western Europe in the 20th century, this became a major theme in the political science literature, median voter theory, this idea that the far right or the far left have to move to the center if they want to win elections. They have to build broad-based coalitions. And this was particularly the case with the Christian Democrats and socialists because their natural constituencies were a minority. So in the case of socialists, we're talking about workers. In the case of Christian Democrats, Christian conservatives. There weren't enough Christian conservatives in these societies to just rally your base. You had to go beyond that. And in that sense, in other regions, democratization went hand in hand with ideological dilution. They lost their ideological distinctiveness over time, these far right and far left groups, as they moved to the center. Now, what's different in the Middle East is that, and I argue this, one of the arguments in my book is that where socialists and Christian Democrats had inherent limitations on what they could do with their base. We don't necessarily see the same thing with Islamist movements, that the vast majority of, say, Egyptians don't have an a priori ideological opposition to Islamism as such. That doesn't mean they vote for Islamists, but the basic idea that Islam and Islamic law should play a more prominent role in society, even a central role, that is not something that is anathema in these countries, in these deeply conservative societies. That's a fairly mainstream position, and I'll talk a little bit about the polling, which makes this very clear. Now, one thing that, one thing I found in my research over time is that somewhat counterintuitively, instead of Islamist movements moving to the center during democratic openings, they were doing something different. They were, in many cases, moving further to the right. And this, to me, at first was surprising because it goes against a lot of the literature on Islamist movements, where the presumption is that, and it's called the inclusion moderation hypothesis, that the more you include Islamist groups in the political process, the more they moderate. It seems to make sense, it's intuitive, and it actually accords with our normative preferences as Westerners, so great, it's a good deal. But something didn't seem right to me, and that's what really got me going in my research. So, for example, if we look at what I call the forgotten democratic openings of the 1980s, in Jordan in the late 80s, early 90s, in Egypt in the mid-1980s, and these are significant democratic openings, and particularly so in Jordan. And to this day, 1992 in Jordan registered the highest ever Freedom House scores in the history, in the history of the Arab world. So, for those of you who follow the Freedom House Index, Jordan got a 3.3 in 1992, which is really, really good. And even to this day, no one has been able to meet that. But what I found during these democratic openings, that Islamists were doubling down on their conservative base. They were moving further to the right. And by further to the right, I mean things like trying to ban alcohol consumption, banning co-education at different levels of schooling, trying to ban interest, and also reflecting a kind of aggressive social moral agenda that tried to make the state into a promoter of a certain set of what they would call Islamic values, and this idea of creating or helping to build the pious citizen, that this is what the state should be oriented towards. So why would this be the case? Why would we have this seemingly counterintuitive finding that democracy, instead of pushing Islamist groups to the center, actually may push them further to the right? There's a couple reasons for this in the context of the Middle East. One is that, as I alluded to earlier, these are deeply conservative societies. And I'll just give, so if there is a popular demand for conservative policies, then someone has to supply it. So whether it's Islamist parties or anyone else who's democratically elected, they have to be responsive to popular sentiment on issues like the role of religion in public life. And a couple examples that are quite interesting, especially now in retrospect. There was a 2011 Pew poll, for example, where 88% of Egyptian respondents said they supported the death penalty for apostasy. And this statistic is relevant because for those of you who followed the Bill Maher, Ben Affleck debate about Islam, which got a lot of hype the other month, Bill Maher cited the 90% number. So he was 2% off, but the point remains that there are a lot of people in Egypt who say they support the death penalty for apostasy. So, how do we make sense of that? Also, 80% of Egyptian respondents in that same poll said they supported stoning for adulterers. 70% said they supported cutting off the hands of thieves. Now, I only say this as one of the more striking polling results. I wouldn't kind of go too far with that. Polling is an inexact science, and people may say something to pollsters, but if it actually came to a government implementing what are called the hudud punishments in real life, then they might say, well, actually, like, it's maybe okay in theory, but we don't actually like it in practice. So I would just kind of caution, but there's a lot of other examples of polling, less striking, but I think just as important. So, for example, in another Pew poll, Egyptian respondents said 61% said they supported the model of religion and government in Saudi Arabia, over 17% who preferred the Turkish model. A pretty striking gap there. On gender equality, according to a 2012 YouGov poll, only 18% of Egyptian respondents said they would support a female candidate for president. Now, you might say, well, what do Egyptian women think about that? And only 24% of Egyptian women said they would support a fellow Egyptian woman in the position of head of state. The list goes on. But generally speaking, we can agree that there is large majority support for Sharia, or Islamic law, playing a major role in government. Certainly in Egypt, but also to different degrees in Jordan, in Syria, in Algeria, so on and so forth. There are some exceptions where it gets a little bit lower, like Tunisia, but many of these societies are what we might call deeply conservative. So again, if that's what the people want, then democracies are going to at least take that into account. Another factor is democracy means that you can form a lot of new parties. So in the pre-Arab Spring period, for example, in Egypt, you had the Muslim Brotherhood with a monopoly over the Islamist vote. If you wanted to vote Islamist, that was the only way you could go. But with democracy, you had Salafi parties, or ultra-conservative Salafi parties that believe in a more textualist interpretation of Islam. They were free for the first time to establish political parties. So what you see is the proliferation of Islamist parties, some of whom were further to the right. Now, this leads to what I call a Tea Party effect. I don't know if you have something similar to the Tea Party in Canada, but in that sense, it's not unique to the Arab world that you have a dynamic where the far right drags the center right further rightwards. And we just saw that in, speaking as an American, in our midterm elections, Republicans doubled down on their base, and it seemed to work pretty well electorally. So it's not only in the Middle East where we see this dynamic. We can see it also anti-immigration sentiment in Europe, where it pays to be anti-immigrant or even anti-Muslim in some cases. Now, so this kind of leads to an issue where, it raises the question, what if Egyptians, Jordanians, or anyone else decide through the democratic process that they would rather not be liberal? Or to put it a little bit differently, what if Egyptians or Jordanians decide that they would like to try out an alternative ideological project outside the confines of liberal democracy? That, I think, is one of the key questions that the Arab Spring has raised. And there isn't an easy answer for it, obviously. And I think part of the turmoil that we're seeing now is because there isn't an easy answer. Now, this is where I think there is something, in fact, distinctive about the ideological divides in the Arab world. And we might call it the Islamist secular divide, Islamist liberal, Islamist non-Islamist, however you want to define it. But what we're talking about here is not just divides over power or specific policies, but divisions over something more fundamental, something more existential, over the nature, meaning, and purpose of the nation state as we know it. So these are very high stakes. And this is where another way it's different from, say, Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, is in Latin America you had a lot of polarization, but the primary cleavage was economic in nature. That you had socialists and what we might call the far-right neoliberals. But when it comes to economic issues, you can split the middle. You can have a reasoned discussion because it's about something real. How do you split the middle on religion or ideology? And this is the problem that Egypt faced in its transition. It's the problem that Tunisia faced, and Tunisia's transition was almost derailed last summer. I mean, now it's seen as one of the positive bright spots, but there is still that deep divide in society that is as of yet unresolved. Now, just to kind of illustrate how this unique divide manifests itself in a very real and frightening way, So I was in Egypt a few days before the Rabaa massacre, and some of you may be aware of the Rabaa massacre. According to Human Rights Watch, it was the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So about more than 800 were killed in just mere hours. So I was in Rabaa. So I think it was I left probably August 10th, so a few days before the massacre. And I was interviewing Muslim Brotherhood leaders and activists in the protest site. So this was after the coup, which happened on July 3rd, 2013. And it was a very, like you read about this you read about it in graduate school, the rise of neo-fascism, how people can justify mass slaughter, but it's another thing to actually see it in practice. And it had an impact on me in terms of how as I tried to make sense of what was going on. But essentially what we had is, somewhat surprisingly to some, I suppose, is that the near entirety of Egypt's liberals, Egypt's prominent liberals, not only supported the coup, but either actively supported the Rabaa massacre or tacitly, at the very least. There were very few examples of so-called liberals who spoke out. So it raises the question, how do people who are supposedly committed to liberal values stand by idly or even actively support mass killing? And this, I think, gets to the very existential nature of the struggle, that people who were otherwise seemingly committed to democracy in 2011, when the Arab Spring began, in the interim, a series of events took place which pushed them in a different direction, where they said, democracy is nice in theory, but if it means that our way of life is threatened, then we will choose repression, and we will, in some cases, embrace it. And this kind of gets at the fundamental divide, not just in Egypt, but also in Libya now. So in Libya, we have a civil war, effectively, between two sides. There's geographical and tribal issues, but the primary cleavage in Libya now is between the Islamist side and the non-Islamist side. Tunisia is doing better, but there is still that deep divide that, as I said, hasn't fully been resolved. In most countries in the region, this is the primary cleavage, and to understand it now, as a Western researcher, writer, or I think all of us would say, well, how could good people support mass killing? And that is a fair question. But I think understanding the context of what's at stake, it may actually make sense for a liberal in Egypt to go against democracy. If they have to choose between a more liberal society, however you want to define that, or a democracy that can bring Islamist parties to power and infringe on their personal freedoms, the way they practice their religion, then that's a choice. And many did choose to repress Islamists instead of accepting the results of democracy. Now, this kind of gets, I think, at a bigger issue, a bigger problem, I think, in Western political discourse. I mean, as Americans, and I presume it's similar in Canada, we tend to see liberalism and democracy as going hand in hand. That's the way it worked in our own history, where first there were the foundations of constitutional liberalism, and then and only then did we have democracy in the sense of universal suffrage and full political equality for all citizens. So there was a particular historical sequencing. The same goes for Western Europe. So naturally, we tend to see them as mutually reinforcing. But what happens when they're not? What if more democracy, to simplify it, could mean less liberalism? And I think it's challenging for those of us who are small d Democrats and small l liberals. When there's that trade-off, what do we prioritize? Now, it's not just about Islamist parties, though, because even in more democratic countries that have secular ruling parties, so Malaysia is one of the more positive cases of a Muslim majority country, but the ostensibly secular ruling party there has Islamized its rhetoric and has actually passed legislation that is quite Islamist. I mean, to give the most obvious example that was in the news recently, the secular ruling party, UMNO, has upheld for about 7 years now a ban on Christians saying the word Allah in the word for God. I mean, it's remarkable when you think about it. So the Muslim Brotherhood, if they tried that in Egypt, they wouldn't even dream of it. But in Malaysia, an ostensibly secular party has done this. And it's actually been something that some would argue has gotten them more support from conservative Malay Muslims. We can look at similar examples in Indonesia where, again, Islamist parties haven't been in power, but supposedly secular parties in various ruling coalitions have actually talked about implementing Sharia law. And on the local level, we have seen Sharia ordinances in a number of districts. So the point here isn't just about Islamist parties, it's about the nature of democracy and the need, if you want to win elections, to be responsive to what is a conservative religious sentiment. Now, well then how do we find a way out of this? So you might say, well, the Muslim world has to work through a secularization process, that there has to be a reformation of some sort. Now, I don't want to get into this too much, but I would just offer a couple of provocations on this point. I would argue that Islam is distinctive in how it relates to politics. Now, this isn't necessarily good or bad, it just is. And I think that gets us into some controversial territory. But I think, and I'll just give you a couple examples of how it may be distinctive. Founding moments matter, and Muslims or anyone else, no one's bound to their founding moment. Muslims aren't bound to their founding moment, but they can't fully escape their founding moment either. And if we look at the example of Prophet Muhammad, he was, unlike, say, Jesus, a head of state, a theologian, a cleric, a merchant, a warrior, and a politician, all intertwined into one. So that does present some issues for those who want to embark on a secularizing mission. And if we mean by secularization, trying to find ways to separate religion from politics, or at least to privatize religion at least a little bit, they run up into a variety of obstacles because they have to go against the weight of history. They have to go against the prophetic model. And if we look at, in comparison, Jesus, I mean, leave unto Caesar what is his. Jesus was not a head of state. He was a dissident against a state. And we can go on about, the different aspects. The role that law plays in Christianity is not the role that law plays in Islam. I mean, there's a corpus of Islamic law that can't just be discarded, where there isn't really an intrinsically Christian conception of the state. There isn't something, there is canon law, but there isn't Christian law in the way we talk about Islamic law today. And in fact, the early Christian communities coexisted with pagan and non-Christian sources of law, and it wasn't a problem. Roman law, for example, for many centuries. But if we want to also look at the broader sweep of Islamic history, so you might say, well, what about the 1950s and 60s when it seemed like secularism was the dominant ideology in the Middle East? Now, if we look at the broader sweep of 1400 years, that looks more like an aberration than a sign of things to come. And this is where I think we also have to question the liberal determinism that's, I think, implicit in so much, or explicit in so much of our public discourse, that inevitably all societies move towards this final endpoint, this end of history. What if that's not the case in the case of the Middle East? Now, I'll just kind of put that to the side. I don't want to go into that too much. Now, where does that kind of leave us? So what mainstream Islamists have tried to do, they're quite modern in the sense they're trying to take pre-modern Islamic law and reconcile it to the modern nation state. That is essentially the project of Islamic modernism, which was the precursor to the Muslim Brotherhood and other mainstream Islamist movements. Now, their approach has been slow, gradual, prodding. They don't call for revolution. They haven't. The Muslim Brotherhood's argument is, for the most part, work within existing state structures, work within the democratic process, and that is the best way to Islamize society and to ultimately achieve the Islamic State. That's their project. Now, this is where the coup in Egypt is such a defining moment, and this is why I think a lot of us were worried when we saw what was happening in July 2013, that this was essentially a negation of an important option that was available to people, this idea that you can work within the system. And the Egyptian coup comes on top of other similar experiences, I think most prominently 1992 Algeria, another coup against a democratically elected Islamist party. Egypt, I think, Egypt has become the defining moment in the mainstream Islamist narrative. That's what we've seen in the past 15 months. And now we're seeing a discussion about, does it make sense to work within existing political structures? Does it make sense to work within the existing nation state? And groups like ISIS, and this will, as I close, I want to say a few words about where ISIS fits into this. ISIS, a month after the Egyptian coup, the spokesman Adnani released a statement, and there was a paragraph, a very interesting paragraph, on the Muslim Brotherhood's experience. So Adnani pointed to the coup as an example of why the Brotherhood's model was bankrupt, and went even further and essentially accused the Brotherhood of being kuffar, or disbelievers. But the message here was that, look, the mainstream Islamists have tried. They counsel patience. They tell their followers, wait 20 years, 30 years, 80 years for the Islamic State, but above all, be patient. What ISIS has said is something quite different, that you don't need to wait, that the only way to achieve the Islamic State is by imposing it through brute force. That is their narrative. And in some ways, that narrative has been vindicated. And in a very narrow sense, and perhaps even more than a very narrow sense, they have been able to achieve something that the Brotherhood never did, which is actually establish an Islamic State on proper territory. Obviously, their vision for it is completely different than the Brotherhood, but they can point to real successes in capturing and holding territory and governing. So this is the other model. And then you might say, well, what about the liberal democratic model? Sadly, that doesn't exist. There isn't a liberal democratic model in the Middle East today. Maybe there will be one in decades to come. But the alternative to accepting mainstream Islamists in the political process is repressing them, and that's what we're seeing in Egypt. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we see a violent approach from groups like ISIS. But I think one of the major points here is, and I hate to say this 4 years later, but I think one of the major lessons of the Arab Spring is that violence does in fact work. Whether it's autocratic regimes, repression has been successful. When we look at ISIS, their management of savagery, their instrumentalization of brutality has been successful. And this is a very unfortunate lesson. Even if ISIS was defeated tomorrow, I think that their influence on the region, it will be felt for a very long time to come. And a couple examples here. They forced a discussion of not just their caliphate, and it should go without saying that the vast majority of Muslims don't share ISIS's ideology. But ISIS has forced a discussion about a caliphate, the idea of a caliphate. If we had talked a few years ago, the caliphate wasn't part of our discourse. That's not what people were talking about. But now, many Muslims are forced to contend with this issue. Because ISIS has risen to such prominence, they have to say what they think about a caliphate. Not necessarily ISIS's, but the idea of one. And the caliphate survived in the Muslim world until 1925. And there is a kind of symbolic power to the idea. These are ideas that do have resonance throughout Islamic history for a variety of reasons, but one of them is during the time of the Caliphate, that was when the Muslim empire had become one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. And then what we see over several centuries is a very precipitous decline. So I think when a lot of Muslims talk about the Caliphate, they're trying to make sense of how did we go from where we once were as a civilization to where we currently are after the end of the caliphate in 1925, but that process had started well before, during the colonial period. So from now on, so ISIS has removed the mental block of the caliphate. It will be talked about for the foreseeable future. And it's worth noting that other extremist groups like Al-Qaeda were very careful about not getting ahead of themselves. They didn't try to establish a caliphate just because of the caliphate had such weight in history. You don't want to mess with that. ISIS is messing with it. They actually went there. And from now on, anytime there's an ungoverned or ungovernable space, an extremist group is going to think to itself, maybe we should establish our own little emirate in this particular piece of territory. We can never undo that. That is the reality of the region right now, and will be. And this is where I think we have to really recognize, and I'll just kind of end on this note, is recognize the power of religion as an independent variable in political science speak, but that there's a tendency sometimes, again, kind of liberal discourse, to kind of dismiss religion as epiphenomenal, that religion and ideology are simply products of a given set of material and economic factors, that's not what's really driving people. And that's why, we hear this argument that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. They're just using and abusing Islam. That may be true, but they believe, and there should be no doubt about this, they believe that what they're doing is Islamic. And that's what gives them that strength. It gives them internal cohesion. It strengthens morale. And the fact that ISIS fighters are actually willing to die, not just accepting it, but even sometimes embracing death, gives them a built-in advantage over, say, the Iraqi army, where their fighters, their soldiers, are not willing to die. And this is where another lesson, I would say, of the Arab Spring is that a small group of ideologically committed rebels can go a long way. You don't have to get majority support. You don't have to get a lot of Muslims to agree with you. You just need to have a core base of people, and then you have a situation like in Mosul in June, where about 900 ISIS fighters are able to overtake a police and army force of about 30,000. And we also saw something similar recently in Yemen, where again a small force of Houthi rebels were able to overtake the U.S.-backed Yemeni army. So this is the power that religion can have in motivating people who believe in a particular cause. Now, that's not to say that religion is the whole story. It's necessary but not sufficient. And this is where you had a perfect storm in Syria and Iraq. You had the religious motivation, but you also had failures of governance and failures of the democratic process. And it's no mistake that ISIS became what it was in the absence of security, in the absence of a working state in Syria. So ISIS needs that to thrive. So we have a perfect storm, a confluence of factors. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this all means for U.S. or Canadian or Western policy. But I think this faith that... So President Obama has made some interesting statements that suggest he's a bit of a historical determinist. He says things like, groups like ISIS have no place in the 21st century. And almost implicit in that is a sense that groups that are so religiously fanatic, they can't possibly win. Because how the sense that reason will prevail, that the rational will prevail amongst us. And this leads, I think, sometimes to a set of policy prescriptions where it's based around the assumption that ISIS will burn itself out. Because how could a group that's so savage and so brutal succeed for so long? It's inevitable that such a brutal group would burn itself out. But I think that's problematic because I think, if anything, ISIS is a product, is a very modern product. It does have a place in the 21st century. And in fact, for the rest of the 21st century, we're going to be seeing a lot of groups like ISIS, and we shouldn't deceive ourselves otherwise. Now, I think it's unfortunate that, considering that this is I think it's a very serious threat. I think it's unfortunate that I think the Obama administration has adopted what is in effect a policy of containment. We can get into that later. I don't think that the Obama administration has a policy that's actually meant to defeat ISIS. But in some ways, even if we did, it would be, I don't want to say it would be too late, but there comes a point where you can't undo the damage for the reasons that I mentioned. We can never go back to the way things were before in Iraq or Syria, or for that matter, in Egypt. So I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but sometimes things don't get better and they get worse. And I think what we've seen the last couple years, it's been disturbing and dark for me and others who have lived in the Middle East during this period. But I fear that it might actually continue getting worse. Thank you.
Dr. Hamid will accept questions. We have a mic that will be passed around. So please identify yourself. And the first speaker, Elliot.
Hi, it's Elliot Tepper, Carleton University. A very illuminating and revealing comment on many things. I think you've explained to us a perspective that is not often heard, and thank you for that. It does leave us, however, with the question of what to do about those within the region who actually did dance in the streets, who actually did believe in liberal democracy. Are we to abandon the liberal democratic forces, those who actually strive for a transformation in the direction of what we would consider a modern political entity, of modern form of governance? And I preface that by suggesting that for a very long time, it's been one of the things I've had to do is people here tend to say, oh, well, it's the Middle East, and give up on it. And what I've been suggesting for a long time is don't give up on those people who have been trying to move in the direction that we would recognize here as a liberal democratic normative form of governance. Are we to abandon them? Are they gone? We know that people you danced with in Tahrir Square are now in jail. So we know the deep state is back in Egypt itself, but that's a way of suppressing rather than evolving the situation.
Should I go? Yeah. Okay. So I think one thing I would say is that I think it's, if we want democracy to succeed in the Arab world at some given point in the future, I think we have to accept that it probably won't be liberal, or at least it won't be as liberal as we like it to be. So that would be my starting point. That, that doesn't mean we shouldn't support Islamists. We should support processes. We should support outcomes. And if Islamists win, so be it. If socialists, communists, whoever wins, so be it. Now, what should we do about those who we might call liberal Democrats? I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that Western countries should get into what is essentially an internal ideological debate. And that's why I think it's always better to support processes rather than specific actors or individuals. But I think, sure, I don't think there's anything wrong with actively supporting liberal groups. The problem is, who are the liberals? Do they really exist in large numbers? And it depends what we mean by liberal. Now, a lot of the liberals, as I mentioned, are people who support things that are anathema to us. They've supported the repression of one of the largest political actors in Egypt. We might talk about Tunisia, that there was a secular group, a coalition that just won the elections the other week, but they're not necessarily liberal. They're secular, but their commitment to individual rights and classical liberalism isn't still in question. So if we can identify them, great, but we shouldn't kind of pin our hopes on what is a small constituency. And this is a challenge for Egyptian liberals or Jordanian liberals, that they actually have to make their case to their people and try to build support. It's not going to happen overnight, but that's a slow process of institution building, of party building, of reaching out to people in rural areas and saying, this is what liberalism could mean in the Egyptian context. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of that, to the extent that even so-called liberal parties in Egypt don't self-identify as liberal, because liberalism, the word, it's cognate in Arabic, has a connotation of irreligious behavior or even atheism. So it's a very much an uphill battle.
Norihiro Okuda, Japanese ambassador here in Canada. Thank you very much for your very illuminating lecture on Islamization of the Middle East. I have got one comment about the support to the democratic liberals in the Middle East. I don't think this is a very effective way to bring about democratic governance in the Middle East. The more important thing is to give ordinary people sort of more elementary educations. If you talk about situation in Egypt, although Egypt is one of the most developed countries in the Middle East, and yet if you take a look at the ordinary educations for youngsters, you have got to do more serious things about to develop the economic, educational system. Unless Egyptian people are fully educated in languages, in mathematics, basic social matters, there's no way for them to understand the real value of democracy. And therefore, on the other hand, I have to talk about the sort of general trend of Islamization in the whole entire society of the Middle East, including Egypt. And where they don't have any sort of proper education system, the Islamic education system controls of the mindsets of ordinary people. And therefore, here I have got a rather cynical view about the Islamic education. I think you have to give more sort of secular. I don't want to use the word secular, but the ordinary education to youngsters. That should be the beginning of the process of democratization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ambassador. So I would say education, economic development are key parts of the puzzle, but I worry that if we take them in the absence of political and democratic reform, it'll fall well short. I think it has to be. So part of the issue too is that in countries like Egypt, but also to various degrees in other countries, some of the most educated, including Western educated people, are also the most anti-democratic. It's an odd outcome, but it's not totally unprecedented. Thailand has a similar problem, and the supporters of the recent coup in Thailand were the well-educated, the middle and upper middle classes. But it does, I think, raise some very challenging questions about what a Western education or even higher levels of economic well-being can do. But there's also the question of quantity of education versus quality. I mean, perhaps we could argue that the people who are well-educated haven't really gotten the essence of what a liberal education is. But there's also this sense that because they have this education, they see the masses as a threat. And this is a tension that we see in a lot of societies, that if we let the masses vote, the uneducated masses, then God knows what they're going to do. So we, as the educated elite, we have to protect against the tyranny of the masses and so on. So education has to be part of it, but if there isn't a real effort to address the question of what do we do about democratic processes and do we respect democratic outcomes, I worry it won't be enough. And let me just go back to the previous question just very quickly. But none of this means that we should give up. We bear, America, I don't know how much responsibility Canada bears in all this, but the Western powers bear responsibility for, in my view, their lack of action after when the Arab Spring began. So we can look at ISIS and Syria, and I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, they're just killing each other, let's just kind of shrug our shoulders and move on. But I think by doing that, we absolve ourselves of our own responsibility, our failure to intervene in Syria, and to do something about mass slaughter, and 200,000 killed now, or leaving Libya to its own devices after Gaddafi fell, and we're seeing the results of that, of essentially being complicit in the Egyptian coup, at least after the fact, where Kerry, just a few weeks after the coup, lauded the generals, saying that they had restored democracy. And now, so I mean, there's a lot of examples where we could have done more to support what we consider to be our democratic ideals, and we didn't. There wasn't even a mini Marshall Plan, to say nothing of a Marshall Plan. And I hoped, and others hoped, that the Arab Spring would present an opportunity to get it right, that we could finally think about fundamentally reorienting our policy in the Middle East and how we do business in the Middle East, our dependence on autocratic regimes. So there was an opportunity, and I think that the Obama administration bears significant responsibility for not doing more. And unfortunately, that's also partly why Europe didn't do much either, because we've also learned that when America doesn't lead in, say, Syria, no one else wants to lead either, and there's a vacuum. So we shouldn't give up, and I think if we really had to talk about what the U.S. and Europe could do to improve the situation, we talk about what would really be a massive undertaking, and we'd have to talk about nation building, we'd have to talk about billions of dollars in financial commitments. And I don't know if there's a stomach for that, but I think if we want to defeat ISIS, if we want to stabilize the regional order, if we want to have at least a better chance of political reform and better governance in the medium to long term, it requires a much larger international commitment. And I'm not sure if we're okay with that, but I think we have to be honest about what it takes.
So thank you, Shadi. My question then is partly about what it takes because before we can get to the rebuilding, my question is about your comment in regards to ISIS, that it was unfortunate that U.S. President Obama had a policy of containment rather than defeat. And I take it that that's a criticism of Canadian policy as well, since we're helping in that containment policy with 6 fighter jets. So could you elaborate on what you mean by a policy of defeat? What would that look like? Are you an advocate for Western boots on the ground?
So, so there's still there's a gaping hole in our Syria strategy, and Syria is a big part of the ISIS problem. Obviously, I think it's a little bit more positive in Iraq, but there is no strategy. I mean, so far what the U.S. is willing to do is $500 million to train about 5,000 fighters over the course of a year, and as we've recently found out, that training effort hasn't even started yet. So, what is it? It's been like 6 months since the fall of Mosul, and we still haven't gotten serious about training Syrian rebel fighters who can fight both ISIS and the Assad regime. And that's the key question for me, and I would hope for others, that can there be a third force in Syrian society that can counter both ISIS and the Assad regime? The Assad regime is the elephant in the room. And if the Assad regime is in fact one of the root causes of the rise of ISIS, then we have to address that root cause. And the Assad regime has indirectly and even sometimes directly encouraged the rise of ISIS, to say nothing of their early policy of brutality against peaceful protesters, which created the vacuum which ISIS would later take pleasure in filling. So what do we do about the Assad regime? And it's remarkable to me that even after airstrikes started in September, time and time again, the moderate rebels, or I don't like the word moderate so much, let's just call them mainstream rebel forces. So Syrian SRF, Syrian Revolutionary Forces, Harakat Hazm, the U.S. backed, the people that we've been backing to some extent for the last couple of years, they've been begging us for greater support. They've been saying essentially, ISIS is coming in. They're going to take our territory. Is the West going to help us, or are we going to be defeated? So even after we know, no one can use the excuse that we didn't know the kind of threat ISIS was. But time and time again, they've been overrun, even just in the last month. So we're still seeing this. So it suggests that there isn't a serious policy in Syria. And as commentators who focus much more on the mainstream Syrian rebels have said, they run the risk of being decimated as a force in Syrian society. And the Obama administration, everyone has said that you need local boots on the ground. So Syrians or Iraqis to fight ISIS. That's the only way you recapture territory. But if the very forces we need to fight ISIS are being undermined to this very day, then what hope is there in Syria? Now, my colleague Ken Pollack, and people may have disagreements with him, but he did write a very interesting article, a very ambitious article in Foreign Affairs the other month, where he essentially outlines a detailed plan for building a Syrian rebel army that can serve as a third force in Syrian society. He puts the price tag at $3 to $10 billion annually for 2 to 5 years at least. Look, I mean, people might say, well, no way that's going to happen, but I think he's one of the few who's actually been very serious about what it requires on the ground. And this is where I think there's a major mismatch between means and ends. Obama says that we want to defeat ISIS, but the means that we've deployed don't even come close. So I think we have to do one of two things: accept openly and say containment is the best we're willing to do, and then means and ends will be matched. On the other hand, if the goal is in fact defeating ISIS, as I personally think it should be, then we should try to find a way to close the gap between means and ends. I think we have to be honest about our choices. But I would say that also in the kind of medium to longer run, what is the intellectual framework for fighting ISIS? It's not just about boots on the ground. It's not just about military. It's about looking at the root causes. So as I mentioned, failures of governance and failures of the democratic process are key issues here. Do we have anything to say about democracy in the Arab world today? And it's worth noting that in Obama's September 10th ISIS speech, he did not mention the word democracy even once. So if this is Obama's war on terror, I guess I would pose the question, where is his freedom agenda? Bush had a freedom agenda to his war on terror. For all of his faults, at least there was something offered there. Obama has not articulated an intellectual framework for U.S. policy. We don't know what America's vision is. We don't know what the strategy is in the medium to long run. And that's why people are very confused in the region. And one question I kept on getting when I was living in the Middle East is, we hate U.S. policy, but at the same time, we don't really know what it is. We're really confused. Help us make, what is going on here? And I think for a lot of people in the region, it's mind-boggling to make sense of U.S. policy over the last couple of years.
Thank you. My name is Vasily Kulyshev. I'm working for the Russian Embassy in Ottawa. Thank you for your presentation. My question concerns the continuation of what you've just said about the Syrian situation. And as you probably know, there was a real possibility in August last year of a US-led military operation against the Assad government. And at that time already, the Assad government forces were on the offensive against the anti-government forces in Syria, including ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, Islamic Front, and other minor groups. What if you think, what if the idea of this US-led military operation was indeed made real then, more than a year ago from now? And where would be the Western Front against ISIS?
Wait, so you're talking about Western military intervention against Assad?
Yeah, I mean this limited operation against
the pinprick operation.
Yeah, the pinprick operation
sure.
after the crossing of Red Line. Thanks.
Yes. So I would even go earlier than that. I think that military intervention in Syria against the Assad regime should have been discussed seriously in early 2012. I think that things would have turned out quite differently if there was an early response to the mass slaughter, especially as rebels were marching towards Damascus. The momentum was on their side. There was a real chance, if they just had a real additional boost in the form of no-fly zones, safe zones, and were able to carve out territory, kind of Benghazi model, I think that they would have had a lot more going for them. And it's very striking to see how strong the rebels were in 2012 and how weak they are today. And it's worth noting, I think, that the rise of ISIS and other extremist groups was not just predictable, it was predicted. I mean, I was in meetings with U.S. officials, and there were colleagues of mine who focus entirely on Syria who were warning senior U.S. officials throughout 2012 and 2013, this is going to happen if we don't act. ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, whatever ex-extremist group, take your pick, they're going to gain ground if something isn't done. So this is where I don't think anyone can plead not knowing or not being aware of what would happen. Now, I think in August 2013, there was a final opportunity. The red line was crossed because of the chemical weapons, and I think that in some ways it was already too late, but it would have been better. Now it's really, really too late. So I think that we'd be having a different conversation right now if there was a Western intervention in August 2013, along with, so that wouldn't have been enough on its own, but along with a real effort to boost mainstream rebels and give them the kind of U.S. Military support and assistance that they were begging for.
Hello, my name is May Habib. I'm an MA candidate at NIPSI at Carleton University. Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation tonight. I guess it's a convoluted question, but Hosni Mubarak, who is the ex-president of Egypt, famously said that Egyptians only know how to be ruled under autocracy. And I'd like to think that's not true, but clearly the Western exported definition of democracy, as we saw in Iraq, doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And as you've mentioned, religion, especially in the Middle East, with Islam, can't really be divorced from politics in that region. So what is there to be said about the way we're trying to export democracy and the way we think about democracy and how it can really be applied on the ground in countries like Egypt? I'm not even talking about Saudi Arabia, in countries like Egypt where people are generally more liberalized in their definition of Islam. How much flexibility is there with that democracy? Sorry.
Well, first of all, I don't think we do much exporting of democracy. So, I mean, certainly under the Bush administration, that was an argument. Exporting democracy in Iraq was a total failure, and we can debate whether or not that was the actual main intention of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But I think, if anything, what we've seen with the Obama administration is a very conscious and concerted deprioritization of democracy promotion in the region. So if anything, I think the balance has gone very much in the other direction. I think the way to address the issue is again to not look. So do Egyptians have a problem with democracy? I'm not even sure what that. Well, we could have said the same. So sometimes I think that based on what I've seen, and I worry, like how, and again, how do you explain the fact that so many people who initially supported democracy turned against it? So it does raise the question. But I don't think we should kind of see that as something that's embedded. Egyptians don't have to. I mean, culture is not static. Culture evolves. Circumstances matter. Context matters. So I don't think Egyptians are doomed to supporting an autocracy indefinitely. If anything, we can look just a couple years earlier and say, well, in a very different context, Egyptians seem to be clamoring for democracy. So it changes, and it's sometimes support for democracy goes up, sometimes it goes down. But I do think that you're right that there is a real, or maybe even Mubarak is right that there is a real problem here. That so just to kind of give a comparative example. So I've, as part of another project, I've looked at different coups over the last several decades, and so far I haven't been able to find an example of a military coup against an elected government where the near entirety of liberals supported the coup. So the closest corollary in terms of ideological polarization would probably be Chile in 1973. But the liberals were split. Many liberals did support Pinochet in the coup, but many liberals did not. And even those who did support the coup changed very quickly. So the Christian Democrats supported the coup at the very start, but after about a year or so, you start to see them shifting towards opposition. We're not seeing signs of that in Egypt, and I used to play a game, not a very nice game, a sad game, with some colleagues where we would kind of say, how many liberals, how many prominent liberals in Egypt opposed the coup? And this is not being hyperbolic. When we played this game and tried to count on our fingers how many people opposed the coup, we would sometimes get to 4, depending on who you consider a liberal. And I don't mean I mean literally 4. So that suggests that there is something distinctive, but I don't think I would say it suggests an opposition. It suggests an incompatibility with democracy. It suggests a very deeply polarized context where the issues are existential. Now, I think we can think creatively about ways to mitigate this. So I'm under no illusions that people will stop hating each other, but I would argue that people should agree to hate each other within a peaceful political process. So for me, the hatred is, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But the question is, what do you do with that hatred? And this is where power sharing arrangements, where institutional and electoral engineering, ways to kind of limit the concentration of power. We can think about ways whereby which minority groups can have veto power. There are the consociational democratic models of continental Europe. Scholars like Liphart have done a lot of work on this, but there's ways to think creatively about institutions so that we don't. Part of the problem in Egypt was that power was concentrated in the hands of the president. And this is why if I had one policy recommendation for every Arab country, it would be weak ceremonial presidencies. Move towards pure parliamentary systems, because when you have that one guy, whether it's Mubarak or Mohammed Morsi, and you have a weak parliament, it channels a lot of anger towards one person, and you see, and that exacerbates polarization. And I think we also have to move away from individuals and towards party systems. And again, when you have a presidential system, you think a lot about the individuals. We need to think more about parties, parliaments, and proportional representation. So I think there are ways when you kind of design institutions in the founding moment, if you will, to think about how to share power more effectively between groups that hate each other. And it's been done in other places. I don't want to say it's an exact corollary, but we can talk about the Flemish and the Walloon in Belgium. I mean, in Europe, we've had examples where people, seemingly hate each other, but there are very creative models for them sharing power.
Thank you. I would like to ask the Vice President of Public Affairs for CIGI, Fred Kunz, to thank our speaker.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Shadi, for your remarks today. The point of the CIGI Global Policy Forum is to inform and engage policy-making circles here in Canada on the most vital issues of the day. And from your expert vantage point, you've certainly done so here today. You exhorted us to understand Islamists on their own terms, to see the inherent contradictions between liberalism and democracy, at least in Western terms, when applied in the context of the Middle East. And although you regretted ending your formal remarks on a pessimistic note that things might get worse before they get better, in the question and answer session, you did point to possible long-term solutions, from matching resources to goals, having coherent foreign policies, military intervention when needed and timely, and then in the long term, the massive investments needed in rebuilding institutions and governance and political process along the lines you described. So for all of that very valuable commentary, we'd like to thank you once again.